Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Russ Moore. I'm the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs here at CU-Boulder. And on behalf of Chancellor DiStefano, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our campus and to the international conference entitled Media and Religion, The Global View. This is the fifth in a series of conferences to be held here since the founding of our Center for Media, Religion, and Culture. Our center is unique in a number of ways. It's one of only 5 such academic efforts worldwide, and internationally recognized as the first and arguably the most distinguished among them. Faculty and graduate students here have been conducting cutting-edge research, speaking and publishing about interaction between media and religion for over 20 years. We think of this center as a particular expression of this campus, which values and encourages interdisciplinary work and where important scholarship on a contemporary religion can be found in more than a dozen different departments and colleges. As the program for this conference illustrates, it's only through such interdisciplinarity that we can make progress in our understanding of the contemporary mediation of religion. You may be aware that we are creating a new and unique academic context for interdisciplinary work at the intersection of media, culture, and society. By this time next year, we expect to have in place a new College of Media, Communication, and Information, which will not only foster teaching and research efforts with scholarship at its core, but which will also innovate exciting new ways of publicly expressing that scholarship. It's precisely that approach to scholarship that can best bring the resources of a research university to bear on complex questions such as those represented in the program for this conference. It is absolutely essential that scholarship take on this challenge. Religion in the 21st century continues to retain its cultural centrality and its potential for effects in social, cultural, and political spheres. This meeting is focused on how all finds its force and effect in the global context. It brings together scholars, professionals, experts, and interested individuals from 17 countries in the first such international conference under this theme. It assumes that there is much to be learned about how religion contributes to and emerges from an increasingly mediated global discourse. The program of this meeting makes it clear to me that the challenges facing our center continue to grow in their breadth and depth and underscores the importance of the center's work as we move forward. Now I'd like to call on Professor Stuart Hoover, director of our center, who along with Associate Director Nabil Echabi has planned this meeting to come forward and add his welcome and to get us underway. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Russ. From the beginning of our planning for this conference on media and religion in the global context, we knew we needed to hear from someone with extensive and substantive experience looking at, thinking about, and covering religion. We quickly thought of Jane Little. Her biography can be found in your conference materials, but it deserves recounting here. Jane describes herself as a broadcast journalist and writer who combines specialist reporting on religion with a wide brief as a host. She regularly hosts news and current affairs programs for the BBC, both domestically and for World Service. She also works as a BBC Washington correspondent, doing live reports for TV and radio. Jane was born in Kendal, Cumbria, in Britain's Lake District. She read theology and religious studies at King's College, Cambridge, and was awarded a Fulbright scholarship, which brought her to Harvard, where she studied the relationship between religion and politics in the United States. Jane created the role of religious affairs reporter at the BBC World Service, and later the role of religion editor at The World, the distinguished and influential joint production of Public Radio International and WGBH Boston. She has written and presented documentaries from across the world and is currently writing a book on spirituality and health. What this account doesn't say is how exceptionally Jane Little has carried out these various tasks. Any of us who are regular listeners to the BBC Sunday podcast know her voice well and have been impressed with the intelligence and insight she brings to interpreting religion for large and broad audiences. She contributes a quality that is unfortunately rare among journalists who seek to write or talk about religion. She understands that we need information and insight, but demonstrates through her work that to achieve information and insight about religion requires concepts and vocabularies which give meaning to the information we consume. She has been a pioneer in helping craft such public languages about religion for a global audience. I'm pleased to be able to introduce Jane Little.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm not sure how I followed that. Very nice, glowing introduction. But it is a real pleasure and a great privilege to be with you tonight, and I'm grateful to Professor Stuart Hoover, to Nabil, to Provost Russell Moore for inviting me to come here to share some of my experiences in covering religion and the ways in which I've seen the beat change, rise, fall, evolve over the last 2 decades of my career, which has been largely focused on religion as a correspondent, as an editor, and as a presenter, or host, as you say here, both on staff and off staff and on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's where my experience is, but I'm very interested in hearing perspectives on the coverage of religion from other parts of the world. In some ways, I feel like I've come full circle because Stuart Hoover helped launch me on my path, though I doubt that he actually knows that. It was while doing an undergraduate dissertation on televangelism that I read his illuminating book on the subject, Mass Media Religion. I actually read it on a beach at UC Santa Barbara, as I recall, which certainly accentuated its many positive qualities. And his book deepened my interest in religion, the media, and their interactions. And while it didn't exactly inspire me to follow in the footsteps of Pat Robertson, I did in some ways create my own different version of electronic evangelist when I set up the post of religious affairs correspondent for the BBC World Service. It took some zeal for the subject, a fair dollop of youthful ambition, and possibly a dose of fate. Because a fellow journalism student and amateur astrologer who insisted on doing my birth chart told me that as an extreme Sagittarian, I was destined to become a preacher, teacher, or journalist. I guess I combined all three. But I've always had a fascination for the role religion plays in public life, particularly here in America, where it is so rich and paradoxical, the nation with the soul of a church, where religion and politics are such intimate bedfellows, and yet where the separation of church and state remains sacrosanct. I moved here to study that as a postgraduate, with an emphasis on the then powerful religious right, and continued to do so as a reporter. For me, it was a continuum. Being a religion reporter was just like being a student, learning something new every day, extending my horizons. Only there were no exams. I got to travel widely, and the pay was better. Marginally. In the early 1990s, when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge and one of only 2 people in my college, the left-leaning King's College, reading the decidedly unfashionable theology and religious studies, I was often asked, usually at parties by slightly inebriated students, why I would choose such a subject. Was it, they'd add, looking puzzled at the fellow hot pant-wearing student in their midst, because I wanted to become a nun? Church of England priest wasn't quite an option back then for women, though it was about to become one. A few years later, sitting at a table in the bar at the BBC World Service Christmas party, only weeks after I'd begun this new trial beat as religion reporter, I was asked by a slightly drunk colleague, "Why are you interested in religion? Is it because you're religious yourself?" I would get that many times over the years. Incidentally, a political correspondent doesn't get asked how they vote, and it's not deemed to affect their reporting at the BBC, which has always prized its reputation for impartiality, and where the reporter never inserts him or herself into a news story unless in extraordinary circumstances. But I mention these encounters because it gives you a flavour of the bewilderment and even suspicion in a secular 1990s Britain as to why anyone would be interested in religion if it wasn't for purely vocational and or devotional reasons, if they didn't have an agenda. As for that, I would always strongly deny that I had any vested religious interests in the subject. And then I'd embark on a passionate explanation as to why religion mattered in the world in a real and vital way, and how we couldn't understand cultures, societies, and much of global politics without first starting with what motivated most of the people on the planet, which at root was their search for meaning, their most deeply held beliefs and practices. And I suppose that while I didn't become a nun or priest, the studio was my secular pulpit, and the colleague or unseen audience out there was my congregation. Though in the case of colleague, they were not an easy convert to the value of reporting religion in the news. Quite the opposite, in fact. In 1997, I returned to London from studying and reporting in the United States, and I was working freelance for the BBC as a general news reporter and producer. That autumn, a couple of editors, I think far-sighted editors, at the BBC World Service asked me to trial a new role as religion reporter. They had little backing, knew it was a risky proposition, and there were few resources thrown my way. I was given a desk, a very quick tour of the studios, and 4 weeks to see if I could find some interesting news to justify the post. To put it in context, there was a religion department at the BBC which produced well-regarded TV and radio programmes on religion and ethics for the domestic audience. There was also a sister religion department at the BBC World Service, which was well-staffed with producers and put out several programmes a week. Some of you might remember them: Focus on Faith, Reporting Religion, Heart and Soul. But there was no correspondent there to cover religion as part of mainstream news, which was at the heart of what the World Service did and does. In other words, it was a subject that was fenced off and clearly marked religion, and which many news journalists thought should remain so, was something the BBC had to wear to fulfil the requirements of its charter, but was not to invade the superior objective news space. At that point, many of my colleagues considered religion coverage as something close to the parish news, churchy, not to be taken too seriously, and in some cases not at all. There were one or two producers who were so anti-God, as they saw it, that I knew it would be virtually pointless trying to get a piece on their programme. At least short of "The Pope is Dead," which, by the way, was the one religion story the BBC dedicated vast resources to for many years, in fact, before Pope John Paul II did deign to provide us with that news. By which time the powers that be could no longer afford the extortionate rent on their fabulous live viewpoint above St. Peter's Square. CNN got the best spot. And I spent several memorable weeks up a ladder. As a further aside, and I'm never given the luxury in broadcasting, so I'm relishing the footnote potential here, that event was handled in a very similar way to the recent death and funeral of Nelson Mandela. Both he and John Paul, towering figures whose passing sparked much reverential reflection on their lives. And in these cases, as well as royal deaths, births, weddings closer to home, the BBC relishes its role as the nation's, and to some extent the globe's, broadcaster. Auntie, as it's affectionately called at home, interpreter and purveyor of meaning to the masses. Anyway, back to my earlier point about ingrained hostility towards religion within the news environment. Religion was held to a different standard. I had to prove I didn't have an agenda. I had to work extra hard at the morning meeting to show why a story was relevant. And meanwhile, an output editor could later reveal personal bias against a news story in ways that probably wouldn't have happened with an arts piece, and certainly wouldn't have done so with one on politics. I don't mean to make my colleagues sound stupid, they definitely were not, but many were older, schooled in 60s Britain, and had fully embraced the secularization hypothesis. Religion was backward, anti-progress, and society, as it developed and got more educated, would relegate belief to the myth section at the back of the bookstore, or, in our case, to the "and finally" slot at the bottom of the news roundup. In those weeks, I was often stopped in the 4th floor corridor at Bush House by one cardigan-wearing hack with the same joke. "How's God today?" The joke soon wore thin. At the other end of the spectrum, there were one or two in the morning news meeting who took my subject very seriously indeed. I was almost seen as an adjunct theologian. I'll never forget one 9 a.m. meeting packed with those who ran the newsroom and the language services, mostly middle-aged men in those days, and they were exchanging views on how to cover the death just announced of the Cambodian dictator Pol Pot. One man, a very decent bloke and journalist, turned to me and suggested that I write a dispatch. That was a 1-minute news piece on the problem of evil. All eyes were trained on me, the new girl on the block, and I took a very deep breath and replied that I thought we might need a 4-part documentary slot for that. It was a milestone of sorts. I think many in the room saw the man's suggestion as at least mildly absurd and as a test of my news judgment, which I guess I passed. From then on, I felt things got a little bit easier, though not less hectic, because I was on this mission to prove that religion was as interesting and relevant as politics, that in fact it often overlapped with and often undergirded political events, and I had 4 weeks to prove it. I also had no idea of what was expected of me, so I'd come in at 5 a.m. to record features and churn out up to 4 news dispatches a day on multiple subjects. I reported on everything from Buddhist monks rioting in Thailand, to sectarian tensions brewing in Kosovo, to Jesuit astronomers gazing at the stars at the Vatican Observatory near Rome, to a Mormon temple going up in Chorley, northern England, which I travelled to and where I sought the views of the locals. I got one old man wearing a cloth cap who gazed up at the gleaming new structure and proclaimed, "It's a bloody eyesore." That was my first and remains my favourite ever vox pop. Eventually, as the last day of my trial period dawned, that same becardiganed hack came up to me in the news corridor, and I braced myself for the anticipated, "How's God today?" Instead, he said, "It's quite interesting religion, isn't it?" Surprised, I concurred, and he said, "I thought you'd just be reporting on the Archbishop of Canterbury's sermons." My first convert. It was quite a victory to savour, and also gave pause for thought. Clearly, many did think of my beat as religious news, rather than religion in the news, the interplay of religion, politics, and public events, which was a more nuanced, blurred around the edges affair. And in fact, I would say the topics I covered over those 10 years when I was religion correspondent and then later as editor and presenter would break down into 2 basic categories. The obvious religion story, the Pope is dead, the gay bishop is elected, and the category 2 story, how and where religion might fit into political and cultural events unfolding in various parts of the world. Clearly there were overlaps between the two, not least in the story of Gene Robinson's election as the first openly gay bishop in the world, an event that would mark a key moment in the culture wars in America, which then sent shockwaves around the Anglican Communion, aided and abetted by the media, the new digital media speeding up the news and amplifying the reactions. The after effects of that election are still being felt, not least in other denominations where the gay issue has also been fought over internally, mirroring what's happening within wider society. Just this week, we've seen the US Supreme Court place a hold on gay marriages in Utah. Sorry, just let me say that again. Gay marriages in Utah. If you'd told me as I watched Gene Robinson's consecration as Bishop of New Hampshire those 10 years ago that 10 years later conservative Mormon Utah would become the 17th US state to allow gay marriage, I'd have been rendered speechless. So dramatic has the cultural shift been here and elsewhere in the last decade. More than a dozen countries now have gay marriage, and it's about to become law in England and Wales. Journalists, like everyone, are scrambling to keep up with the rapid flow of events. So there is no bold line between the 2 types of story, religion in capitals and, yes, religion plays a part here. But as a general rule, I found the category 2 story to be the more interesting, one where I could add value. And that was where the BBC World Service came into its own, because it takes those longer formats with more airtime to allow the sort of space required to explain issues of identity, sectarianism, where religion or theology might or might not play a part in the stories of the day. I got to make many documentaries on anti-Semitism in Europe, on the Dalai Lama and exiled Tibetans, on revolution and reform within Islam in Turkey, Iran, and elsewhere. That was in the year 2000, and countless others that gave me room to explore, ask the big questions, and suggest one or two tentative answers. My thesis, by the way, that the reformists were on top in Iran, was a couple of weeks later miserably undermined when many newspaper editors, a couple of whom I'd interviewed, were jailed. But even in terms of the news bulletins, I would often get the second slot on a story, the one that gave some context to the news piece above it. The domestic news bulletins at the BBC don't have that sort of luxury, neither do they over here. But the World Service I joined did, and it was a deeply rewarding, enriching, and challenging few years. I should mention here that the newsroom manager did call me in and tell me to come back again after those first 4 weeks, and another and another. So I remained on short-term contracts, now practically the only contracts out there, sprinting constantly from one story to the next in my bid to prove mine and the beat's worth. I was made staff eventually in the spring of 2001 and promptly collapsed with an exhaustion-related illness. That September, I'd be lying on my sofa at home, watching the news event that would dwarf all others and emphatically underline the value of having a religion specialist on staff. Some news outlets, such as the Associated Press, already had one. Many others soon added them. And so Islam suddenly thrust itself into the Western news agenda, and the tragic events of September the 11th had the unintended consequence of creating more religion reporter jobs, at least for a while. The early noughties were in some ways the halcyon days for religion correspondence and programs. The widespread attempt to understand Islam as a security threat, as an ideology, as a religion, one which turned out to be far more complicated than most had banked on, was given much air and print time. A lot of the coverage was very negative of Islam, particularly in the tabloid press, encouraged by politicians who painted, and sometimes still paint, Islam as the bogeyman. But there was also a genuine effort to grapple with a phenomenon the Western media had not spent much time on before. That story was swiftly joined by the scandal of the sexual abuse of children by Roman Catholic clergy, one that was broken in the United States by a team of reporters at the Boston Globe with the expertise and resources to expose the abuse and cover-ups in the Boston Archdiocese. Their coverage of the criminal prosecutions of priests prompted other victims to come forward, and a wider pattern of abuse and cover-up became clear. The scandal rapidly spread to other nations, notably to Catholic Europe, where the governments of countries such as Ireland produced damning reports into systematic cover-ups within the church hierarchy. That story, more than any other I can think of, shows the power of an informed and well-resourced media. It challenged religious authority in a profound way, radically upending the old reverential attitudes towards priests. It forced some changes in the way the church did business, yet not enough for many Catholics who voted with their feet and left the pews. I think of the response of the hierarchy to the disgrace of Boston's Cardinal Bernard law. I should say disgrace in the secular sphere, because far from being defrocked or even quietly demoted for his part in the cover-ups, he was given a grace and favour appointment at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. The media's coverage was so critical of the Roman Catholic leadership, which continued to obfuscate to a lesser or greater degree, that few of us could ever imagine a reversal of its fortunes. More on that later. But in the meantime, Pope Benedict was, as Cardinal Ratzinger had been the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog for a quarter of a century, he was not the man to open the doors, to throw them open and reveal a church ready to embrace transparency or to accommodate modernity. Instead, his gaffes and controversial moves, such as his speech at Regensburg that upset so many Muslims, and his reinstatement of a Holocaust-denying bishop, which upset so many Jews, only reinforced the mainstream media's opinion of a papacy and a church fundamentally out of touch with the modern world. If the media is run by a secular elite, that elite was casually smug, its views of a backward religion so easily affirmed. By the time of Benedict, who assumed the throne of St. Peter in 2005, editors in newsrooms were starting to lose interest in the religion beat. One American reporter who's covered religion for many years reflected that the secular media is largely focused on religion in the public, especially the political sphere, not on religion, as lived and practiced within communities. In other words, more focused on my type 2 story. And the problem with that approach, he mused, was that the fortunes of the God beat depend on the ups and downs of the relationship between religion and daily politics. Like me, he was consumed for a while with explaining Islam, reporting on gay bishops and the hot-button issues of the culture wars, evangelicals in politics during the Bush years, the Catholic abuse crisis. But at some point, editors' interest, waned. He believes in the case of Islam, it was because another dreaded 9/11 type event didn't happen, and also because Islam turned out to be complicated. So editors went off it because the categories of secular Western discourse didn't fit neatly, left, right, conservative, moderate, etc., and because the resources that were needed to try to understand them were not there. He and I have both had editors request more coverage, for instance, on the Shia-Sunni split within Islam, surely a subject of ever greater importance now, given the rapid and confusing developments within Islam in the Middle East. But in his case, the budgets are no longer there to do justice to the story, which involves travel and time. And in my case, I'm no longer there. I left the religion beat at the World Service in 2006 to work as a Washington correspondent, and I left it in safe hands. Christopher Lando was a very good reporter who also, unusually, was a theology graduate. He had the expertise and did great reporting, not least on the former Archbishop of Canterbury's comments that Sharia should have a place in modern Britain. What a furore that caused in the British tabloid press. But Christopher decided to leave journalism to pursue a vocation as a Church of England priest. It was a loss to journalism, but should be a gain for the Church, which needs more priests who understand how the news media works. The BBC, faced with another round of budget cuts, used his exit as a chance to quietly close the post. There is now no religion reporter at the BBC World Service, where the largest audiences are still in Africa, a continent where audiences do care deeply about religion and where it retains a very obvious role in shaping identity. And there is no religion department at all. That takes repeating. No religion department at all. Even in the rather hostile secularist climate I faced when I joined, it was seen to be a subject worth covering, even if many believed it belonged in its own silo. Not anymore. And I think for a publicly funded body whose remit is to inform, educate, and entertain, it's a sorry state of affairs. There is one remaining programme, and that's Heart and Soul. It's not made out of the World Service. The producer who makes it is coming out of Manchester, and he does a great job on a tiny budget. Here's my opportunity for a shameless plug. You can hear my interview this month with Joshua Dubois, President Obama's spiritual advisor. He's written a daily devotional for the president each day for 5 years. And in Heart and Soul for the BBC World Service, he tells me about the seemingly most secular of presidents and his deep personal faith. Elsewhere, the professional religion beat has also greatly shrunk. For instance, the Dallas Morning News, which once had 3 religion reporters, 2 religion editors, and a complete religion section, no longer has any of those. To a large extent, the fortunes of religion reporters have risen and fallen in ways that mirror those of the news outlets they work for. As advertising revenues have shrunk, so have newsrooms, and the religion beat is often one of the first to go. In the case of the BBC, it's working on tighter funding from the taxpayer. Clearly, I don't believe the religion beat should be the first to go, but such is the hard reality. At least there are still religion reporters at the New York Times, Washington Post, Times of London, and they do a great job on ever smaller budgets. The BBC's Robert Pigott does a good job of reporting on religion for domestic TV and radio audiences. Meanwhile, as Yonat Shimron points out, while there is no religion reporter at the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, a job she did very well, by the way, there are still part-time religion reporters elsewhere who split their labours between beats. It's better than nothing. Yonat is now the managing editor of Religion News Service, which puts out really interesting religion stories each day, funded by donations and grants from institutions that care about religion coverage. The Lilly Endowment is one. Meanwhile, the Luce Foundation gave a generous grant to WGBH Boston's public radio program The World, which allowed me to set up a religion editor position that oversaw the creation of more in-depth religion coverage. Luce also funds a good series in foreign policy that follows Islam in a changing Middle East. David Gartenstein-Ross recently reflected on how the obituaries for al-Qaeda in the wake of the Arab Spring were premature, to say the least. His sobering first line, "The last year was a good one for al-Qaeda and for jihadism more broadly." And so there's still good coverage in the traditional media, but the landscape has changed beyond recognition since I started at the BBC. There are few religion specialists left who cover the global picture, and they include accomplished ones such as Bruce Clark at The Economist, Tom Hennigan at Reuters, who edits the excellent Faith World blog. But largely, where they exist, it's thanks to much needed help from foundations. So I think there's a great need for informed coverage of religion and events that touch on it, and I lament the professional passing of so many former colleagues. But I think it's too early to sound the death knell completely, and I do see pockets of resurrection, not least at the battered and bruised Boston Globe, which has just this week announced that its hired Vatican watcher John Allen and announced its aspirations to create a Catholicism section. I also see a more positive landscape in the digital media. It is reflecting a major shift in the West from religious affiliation to a more individual quest for meaning and direct experience. It is also clearly shaping and informing that shift, and there are many here in this audience who are more qualified than I am to talk about the ways in which the media are redefining religious tradition, community, meaning and practice. What I would say is that this democratization of media, as reflected in the online social media world of blogging and tweeting, is having a big and largely positive impact on the ways in which spiritual experience is being covered. I say spiritual experience because there is a more immediate engagement in the fluid forms of spiritual expression that the traditional media has had trouble keeping up with. I'm talking of the religion outside the box stuff. Because if the traditional media was slow to see the importance of religion within the public political sphere, religion as part of the so-called hard news story, then it's been even slower to grasp the subtle revolution in a secular West, where many have dropped the religious belonging of their childhood, but not the believing in something other. That's hard to quantify. The Pew Forum on Religion in Public Life here does a good job in America. But I'll give you one snapshot of a changing Britain, as captured in a new podcast series. I was asked to present the launch programme in October of Things Unseen, a podcast produced by an ex-BBC staffer for an independent company and funded by a charity. And it's focused on attracting an audience that's interested in faith, spirituality, the idea, as the banner puts it, that there may be more to life than meets the eye. The launch programme, recorded in the beautiful Southwark Cathedral on London's South Bank, was a panel discussion based on research commissioned into the spiritual beliefs of modern Britain. That survey found that while Britain may well be a post-Christian nation, a former Archbishop of Canterbury's words, not mine, it is far from a nation of atheists. Spiritual beliefs are found across the board, not just among those who follow one of the established faiths. The report found, amongst other things, that more than half of the British believe that spiritual forces can influence human thoughts or actions, or the world around them, and more than 1/3 of the non-religious hold this belief. 1 in 6 of those polled said they or someone they knew had experienced a miracle. Many believed in angels, and younger people are, if anything, more likely to hold such beliefs than older ones. In other words, looking at the subject of spirituality or belief through the lens of established faiths no longer reflects what's going on, at least in Britain and the US. And here in the US, websites such as the Huffington Post are reflecting and informing this development. There's a blurring of the line between analysis and commentary. There are more personal and how-to columns. There and elsewhere on the web, people are interested less in dogma handed down, enforced by religious leaders, and more in individual practice. Click on one link on the power of intention or mindful living, and you find your inbox deluged with daily snippets of spiritual wisdom from all sorts of online gurus. There is out there in the new media age a perfect union of consumerism and spirituality. And presiding over it all is the high priestess, someone I have great admiration for, by the way, Oprah Winfrey. For those who haven't read it, I recommend Catherine Lofton's Oprah, The Gospel of an Icon, which I think beautifully captures a new form of religion taking shape in a new cultural space. And by the way, I think this form of spirituality is often criticised for lacking intellectual depth or communal tradition, for coming out of a me culture. And while there may be justification for that in some areas, I think the criticism tends to come from those whose traditions are threatened by this new religious marketplace. And they tend to overlook the fact that new communities are emerging. It's often virtual communities in, for instance, Oprah's book club. Conversely, by the way, atheism is getting a good airing. The late Christopher Hitchens, the Richard Dawkins out there, the Daniel Dennett's are becoming leaders of a movement defining itself against the still dominant religious culture. Amanda Hancock's the editor of BBC Radio 4's Sunday programme, a religion news magazine for a domestic British audience, which I've often presented and does good coverage of global religion, suggests that atheism may get disproportionate coverage these days, a reflection, she wonders, of the interests of the secular newsroom. I suspect the leader of the Alabama atheists I met a decade ago would strongly disagree with that. On my way to meet him, I drove through an Alabama in the throes of a state election, where roadside signs urged me to vote for Jesus. And when I found him, he told me of the crosses that had been planted on his manicured lawn and the abuse his children had faced at school because their dad was an atheist. I'd guess he's enjoying the news that he's not alone, a bit of solidarity. I've talked about the positive influence of the digital media, of the democratization of religion and its coverage, with so many new voices out there, and that's a good thing. But there is a flip side, and one I believe reinforces my argument that we need more professionals giving informed and as impartial as possible reporting on religion. Because while more people are writing and everyone feels they can weigh in on a subject, it does mean more biased and ill-informed opinion, especially in an age where there's disappearing religious literacy in the West, a byproduct of the move away from established religion. Social media have also been enthusiastically embraced by Islamist extremists. Al-Qaeda has used the arena effectively to put out videos and statements around the globe to recruit more foot soldiers. Jihadists are tweeting their victory poses from the battlefields in Syria and Iraq. Establishment voices, authority figures in Islam and in other mainstream religions, have often been less quick to realize the potential of the digital age, perhaps initially seeing it as a threat or as an irrelevance. Though the Vatican did catch up, and the new Pope has a very active Twitter account. He's no less the most talked about person on the internet, and indeed in the world. Just yesterday, I got a tweet with a link to a story of him picking up a hitchhiker in St. Peter's Square. It turned out, of course, to be a fellow Argentinian priest he recognized in the crowd. And so he and this priest and the Pope-mobile went around the world in an instant. So this brings me to the story you thought I'd forgotten about, the one where the Roman Catholic hierarchy, in its deepest crisis in centuries, manages to pull off the most inspired move. And I speak not theologically here, but as a journalist, the most inspired and savvy move ever by electing the little-known man who got away last time, Jorge Bergoglio, as Pope. The Catholic hierarchy that had been written off as riddled by corruption and sexual abuse scandals, of incapable of putting its own house in order and ever gaining a positive headline again, managed to upend that narrative almost instantly with the election of Pope Francis. The choice of name, the gestures, the humble living and identification with the poor demined the media battlefield, as one colleague put it. And 5 words spoken last summer in response to a question about gay priests, who am I to judge, blindsided the news media and won him many converts in unlikely places. His other potent gestures, the striking symbolism of him washing the feet of Muslim and women inmates on Maundy Thursday, of hugging a disfigured man, of eschewing the trappings of a Renaissance office in favour of the simple robes of a poor priest, of even driving himself around in his old little beaten-up car, have made him something of a saint to a secular world, perhaps in search of one. And so Time magazine embraced him as Person of the Year, and more strikingly, so did the gay magazine, The Advocate. Who would have seen any of this coming 2 years ago, let alone 10 when everything started to go wrong? The big question for the future, can the honeymoon last, as Martin Marty puts it? Arch-traditionalists who've been quietly spitting feathers are taking comfort in the fact that popes can't change doctrine and that he can't do any more than shift the tone. Those on the other side say precisely the opposite. An excellent piece in last month's New Yorker by James Carroll pointed out that church doctrine has and does change on such matters as the Jews killed Jesus teaching, for instance, and also was clearly sympathetic to the view expressed by one Jesuit. Style is not just the cover of the book, it's the book itself. I suspect that view might also find some sympathy among scholars of media, religion and culture. I'll end now with a few predictions of the stories I think we might see more of. The Arab Spring and its messy aftermath remains huge, and what happens in the feuds within Islam in the Middle East will have an enormous ripple effect beyond those borders. Pope mania will continue for a while, but we'll also get a clearer indication of where this Pope is taking his church, not least from the Synod of Bishops in 2014, this year, and the very interesting survey the Pope's commissioned to be discussed there. He wants the views of Catholics on remarriage after divorce and contraception. A Pope seeking the views of his flock, the timely democratization of religion or its downfall. Much heated debate about that. And the culture wars continue to evolve as a once cohesive religious right here has been replaced by alliances across denominations and even religions and national borders as believers fight for their right, for their space in the public sphere. We see battles against religious persecution and for religious freedom at one end of the spectrum, and at the other we see individual fights for the right to wear religious symbols, not to work on the Sabbath, serve alcohol, etc. More contentiously, we see religious claims of conscience pitted against the civil rights increasingly advanced in secular society, most notably in the question over whether believers' right to religious conscience allows them to discriminate against gays or employees who want contraception coverage in their health insurance plans. These arguments are being played out in the courts, in the US Supreme Court, in the European Court of Human Rights, and will continue to do so, reflecting a wider dilemma, succinctly put by a fellow British reporter. Can a broadly secular society tolerate the existence of religious subcultures which live by their own self-imposed rules? Much to reflect on, and greater need than ever, I believe, for the experts to play their role. Because, as any religion reporter and keen reader of Oscar Wilde knows, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. But it's worth giving it an airing. Thank you.
Very much, Jane. That was very, very interesting, as we thought it would be. We have time for questions and answers. With the recording, we would like to have microphones. Perhaps, Nabil, you could handle one, and we could have a volunteer to handle another. And we'll have the floor open for questions. So, who would like to begin?
Hi. First of all, thank you for your fascinating lecture. It worked. I wonder, how do you see the role of the media today when there is a gap that it's really hard to bridge between religions in Europe? You see on one side, and you mentioned it just in the end of the lecture, but I would like you to, if you can elaborate about it, how do you see the role of the media? Is it bridge the gap, or maybe it makes it even worse? between the Islam and Europe?
Very interesting and tough question. There's lots to unpack in there. I think there's one story that leaps out at me, which encapsulated so many angles to the battle between freedom of expression, as some saw it, in a liberal, democratic Europe. Of course, the media itself, a beneficiary and a product of a liberal, Western, democratic culture, which very much strongly supports and defends freedom of expression, versus freedom of religion and people defending their religious rights, their religious worldviews. And the most striking example for me, and it is a few years ago now, although we can mention more recent ones, was the whole furore over the Prophet Muhammad cartoons in Denmark. There were so many different angles to that. But clearly, it infuriated and inflamed so much opinion in the Islamic world. The modern media, with the digital age, soon sent images around the world. We had Danish imams in Denmark travel to the Middle East to share that story of how these 12 cartoons were blasphemous, offended Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. And the fact that you can't even depict images of the Prophet Muhammad was bad enough, but to depict images of a bomb on the head of the Prophet Muhammad was just very inflammatory, basically. And so that triggered this huge firestorm. We had riots around the world, as you'll recall. We had killings of people. It set off a tragic series of events, but it also set off really, really heated debates about the role of the media, about freedom of expression, about the place of religious minorities in Europe, about the accommodations that can be made. It was interesting to see people in the Western media who didn't necessarily think it was a great idea to publish those cartoons come to the defense of the Danish organization that published them, because it was about freedom of expression. It was seen to be a line being drawn in the sand about where the limits of tolerance were of the views of religious minorities. Now, at the time, there were many Muslims who quite reasonably said, hang on, there are some interesting contradictions here. In a Europe that's talking about freedom of expression, it also has several countries which outlaw denial of the Holocaust, that there is a limit to free speech. And so there was all sorts of these interesting debates going on, and a much bigger snapshot of what was going on with religious communities within Europe and how far Europe was prepared to go to accommodate it. So that was one example. In terms of what the media's role is, the media was clearly involved in that to some extent as a proponent, as a defender of free speech and the liberal values that the media really cherishes. But there were also pockets of the media where there were interesting discussions going on, dialogues, interfaith fora, people getting together trying to calm things down. Of course, that sort of story, the interfaith peace conference, the dialogues, is not as broadly covered in a media that tends to focus on friction, on differences of opinion, on big news events. It is quite hard to sell an interfaith conference to news editors in a newsroom, though I do think one should try.
In the back, and who would like to be next? Wait for the microphone.
Is this at all working? Okay. I wanted to know, just to stick to that point, you've covered religion in the States and also in Europe. There was a point in time where people were kind of enthralled with this notion of American exceptionalism. But sociologists of religion recently have been talking about European exceptionalism when it comes to religion, right? That is to say, Europe is the only place where religion is kind of a bewildering thing. The rest of the world is like, yeah, that's something that people are into and people draw stuff from. And Europe is the only place where everyone's like, what is this? So you are in a very kind of unique position to speak to that, I think. Could you speak more about that and elaborate on this kind of, tension between how we treat religion in the public space in the States as opposed to Europe and other parts of the world?
I mean, I think you're right, and I've read Grace Davey, who's very good on in this area. It is the odd the odd continent out in many regards. And, I mentioned the secularization hypothesis, and, religion in Europe was about to die out. We were all post-industrial, getting very progressive and educated, and then all of a sudden, religion turned around and caught Europe off guard. And I think certainly if you look at rates of religious attendance in churches, etc., then Europe's rates are very low. I've lived in the Czech Republic, in Prague, which is seen to be, by some accounts, the most atheistic country in the world. Something like 1 or 2% of people profess any religious belief. So clearly it is the odd man out. And certainly as a European coming to America for the first time, it was absolutely fascinating to me. America is the embodiment of how wrong the secularization hypothesis was. And yet, on the flip side, we're getting data that suggests that religious affiliation, church going is going down quite a lot in America, and we're now getting figures of atheists in the sort of the teens, or 12%, something like that, of atheists, which is quite a large category. Of course, when you start looking at data, it's quite difficult because some of the surveys pose questions such as, do you regard yourself as atheist, agnostic, or something else, non-religious? And it's in that non-religious area that I find there's a lot of interesting things to be done, because a lot of people would say they're spiritual but not religious. There are a lot of people who are interested in, for instance, next month there's a Wisdom 2.0 conference where they're advertising online, and they're talking about this, the intersection of the digital wisdom in the digital age, and they're talking about wisdom leaders that you can go and see. You can go to yoga rooms, meditation. There's an inspiration village. Eckhart Tolle's there, John Kabat-Zinn, all these new leaders who are not being touted, by the way, as religious or spiritual leaders, but as wisdom leaders. People are in search. People are in search of this more immediate lived experience, and I'll quote from the program: join us to experience how to live with more presence in the digital age. So I think all sorts of interesting, fluid things are happening in America and elsewhere, but I agree with you that Europe is very much the odd continent out in some ways.
Because of your professional background, when media coverage of religion, you concentrated on the news, how it's being covered in the news. Can you talk a little bit about the entertainment part of media? For example, Father Ted, I remember. Will we be watching in the future? Do you think there is a kind of a mission, not only the news coverage, but at the same time, entertainment part of it, the coverage of religion? Thank you.
In the early noughties, I was invited to a high-level gathering at the BBC. All departments, news, entertainment, everybody were invited to think about religion in a different way and reflecting the audiences more. I think there was a sense that, religion had come back out of nowhere as if it had never really gone away, but religion came on the scene again fairly explosively, especially with 9/11 and all the fallout from that. And so the news editors and the editors of all the departments, arts, entertainment, science, drama, got together and tried to discuss how to better reflect the views of the British, the audiences, the interests, to try to give a fuller picture of what was going on and to come at religion from different angles. Of course, that was a very top-down approach, and I think it had a very mixed success. So for a while, you started to see dramas, soap operas like EastEnders, which has been on for years, start to tackle some of these religious themes, start to introduce new characters who might be a Muslim, and there might be a gay character, and there are various ethical issues worked out. So they did try it, but I'm not sure that I completely agree with the top-down approach, and then, interest waned and it moved on. But certainly I'm a big fan of the Father Ted. The satirical comedy, the Father Ted, was great. And I wish there were more of it out there.
We'll take you next, but I'll take the privilege of the chair and try a question of my own. I've always been interested in the discourse within discourse about religion journalism. The problem of evaluating religion, that one of the reasons why journalists have been reluctant to cover religion, I think, is because, as Judy Woodruff was quoted as saying one time, there are so many of them, and then you have to choose between them and that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering whether you think that situation will change in this new era you're talking about, where more and more religious expression can kind of well up through social interaction, through digital media, and whether, because it's no longer framed authoritatively by media voices or editorial, decision making, whether there will be more of a kind of discourse of comparing them and is this one better than that one and that sort of thing.
Very interesting. I think yes. That, in this new digital age, we will see much more of that, more of the religion outside the box stuff. I do think traditional media continues to struggle, certainly in terms of the news culture that I've come out of, because when you have a story that breaks, a news story, and it's evaluated for, its value as a news event, there is a reflexive approach that looks for the leaders to speak to, the authority figures. Well, that's breaking down in these wisdom conferences and elsewhere, and in this more democratized space of the new digital media, it is more receptive to introducing other voices who aren't the archbishops, aren't the imams, aren't the rabbis. So there is this leveling going on, but I think, as I say, in traditional media it is difficult, and I have faced that many times, that if I'm covering a hard news story, when I was religion correspondent, there would be a great receptivity to me covering the suicide bombings, and I would be asked again and again, to the point of I got quite sick of it, having to explain the so-called theology of suicide bombing, and go to the people who could talk authoritatively about how it doesn't fit with mainstream Islam, etc. But there was less receptivity in the traditional news space to the kind of more, as many news editors would see it, the touchy-feely stuff, the spirituality. On the other hand, I think audience interest was huge. I mean, it's hard to gauge. We didn't have those ways of gauging it, but there was a great deal of audience interest in a series I did on demographics and the way religions had evolved and the ways in which there was a sort of post-religion religion evolving in secular Europe. And there was a lot of interest in that sort of thing, but I think there is still, in a very structured media environment, in the traditional media, there is this natural urge to go and seek out the authority structures when the authority, the leaders, the voices of authority, when they're not there, they're left scratching their heads a little bit. Also, I think there is a sort of ingrained bias against, I touched on it with this, the feeling that Oprah Winfrey and everything that's going on the internet and these the sort of new spirituality out there, that it's anti-intellectual, that it really doesn't justify much news space. There's a bit of that going on. And sometimes when I was presenting a program, I would be trusted to be the regular news journalist if I was interviewing the Archbishop of Canterbury. I would be expected to be putting the tough questions to him, and would be trusted to do so. But if there was somebody else there who was a little bit more sort of airy-fairy, wafty spirituality, I was told to go really hard on them, because of this sort of suspicion of it and the fact that it really wasn't that justified as religion, if you like.
You started to answer some of my question there, but I was just wondering, when you were talking earlier about having to defend the religious beat with the BBC, and I was wondering how you see journalists approaching defending their coverage of rising mediated religious practices. Use the term out-of-box religion, and I was wondering if you had insight to how journalists will approach issues of legitimacy and authenticity with new religious experiences that are increasingly mediated.
Mm-hmm.
If you had thoughts on that, thanks.
I think it's quite hard for religion journalists to go into these areas because I mean, for instance, when I was religion correspondent, I was often unraveling, trying to unpick whether a war was sectarian or religiously rooted, and we all know that, it all bleeds together, ethnic, sectarian, identity issues. It's very hard to unpick them, but at the same time, I had to justify why the religion correspondent was talking about it. So sometimes I would bat a story away saying, actually, it's really more about economics or ethnicity, and, it could just inflame issues if you talk about religion, because religion is in some ways the oil being poured on the fire, but it's not what started the fire. And so there's this sort of, I spent a lot of my beat trying to define in my own head what was a religion story and what was not. And at the same time, I was wanting to fight my way out of the box and talk about these interesting developments that you're referring to. And so it is a difficult one to navigate. And I think it's happening. But one of the problems with the shrinking of the religion beat and these experts who are watching what's going on in our world is that there's nobody spotting the trends if you don't have a religion correspondent there reading and writing about them. There's nobody seeing what's coming up along the road. And there's nobody really with that sort of expertise to figure out where things are heading. So I think it's a real problem there. And when you had a religion correspondent on the beat looking at, for instance, the gay bishop story, Jean Robinson, it almost came out of nowhere, and yet it didn't, because some of us were reading about it, knew it was going to happen, were able to respond in a different way. And I think if you don't have the experts out there reading, talking to the experts, really sort of, in my world, I would love to see more bridges built between reporters and the academy and policy experts to get everyone talking together, and then reporters naturally reflect more of what's going on in the world. And I think that is why you need specialist religion reporters. I'm not saying they're the only voices. I'm not somebody who suggests you need this authority figure, the Archbishop of Religion reporting at all. I think it's great that there are more and more voices out there. But I do think you do need some sort of ability to contextualize, to give nuance to a story, and that it is one of those areas which is quite hard to accumulate that. Not that, it's harder to be a religion correspondent than a political correspondent. It's a different job, and you're less reacting to daily news events than crafting features and thinking about ways in which religion, spirituality is changing.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation. There is so much concern about the business model of journalism, and you talked about the a podcast, Things Unseen, that's funded in sort of a non-traditional way. And I'm just wondering, is there a future for that, for religion journalism moving forward? Is there enough interest in non-traditional funding that would go into this kind of reporting?
I'm invested in it because it's produced by friends who are coming out with great stories that I've long wanted to report on, and they're giving me work, so I should mention that. In fact, I'm off to Arizona next to talk about spirituality and health issues that I'm interested in. I'm interviewing Dr. Andrew Weil about mind, body, spirit medicine, and a Cherokee medicine man who became a friend of mine, who's a fascinating man and widely read across different religious and spiritual traditions. And we're going to be talking about Native American spirituality, in particular Cherokee. So there's a forum there that they're providing that wasn't necessarily provided in the old traditional newsroom setting. So that's great for people who are interested in it. And I think it should be funded, and it is being funded, and it's fabulous that it's being funded. But it is very difficult to raise money in this harsh environment. It is wonderful that there are big endowments, the Lilly Endowment and the Ford Foundation and Luce and all these organizations out there are becoming absolutely vital if we want this kind of coverage to continue. There are smaller funders in Britain doing the same thing, and these podcasts are done on a shoestring. They're not making me rich, I can tell you that, but it is very rewarding and enriching in another way to do them.
I'll do one more. Thinking, I mean, you know, you don't have to answer this, but I'm wondering whether you've thought about the question of whether some religions get more or better coverage than others. I mean, are there religions that get more and better, and why? Why is that?
I guess, well, I'm talking from a Western perspective and from my experience in the media here, but I mean, I think the coverage has changed, but it has traditionally been, in the olden days at least, quite reverential towards Christianity. In the BBC that I joined, in the section of the BBC that was the religion department, there were a lot of Christian devotional programs put out. And even in the news side of things, which was about religion in the news, it was, and still to a certain extent is, largely about Christianity. Now that also reflects the audience in the domestic sphere because it is still quite a churched audience that listens to that programme. But I would constantly be pushing the boundaries a little bit, very interested in covering different religions. As I mentioned in my talk, Islam has got a real beating in the press for a long time. I think and hope it's changed quite a bit, especially in the broadsheets and in some of the, like the BBC, NPR do interesting reporting on Islam. But Islam remains a big challenge, I think, for us because it remains to a certain extent in much of the media foreign, and people do try to fit it into categories of this discourse that doesn't fit it. And it was interesting after 9/11 to see Western governments such as the British government, and after 7/7, the London bombings, you remember, the British government went out looking for the moderate voices of Islam and tended to try to co-opt certain groups which didn't go down very well in various parts of the Muslim community. And also they looked at Sufis and thought, right, that's our answer, Sufis are great. And then they thought, well, actually, Sufis have quite a traditional view of the Quran and women's rights and things like that. So there was an interesting process going on there and a scratching of the head that continues. And I would like to see more fuller coverage that gives all angles of a story, but certainly Islam became the news because of negative news events, and it's much harder to get into initiatives that are happening within Islam and between religions that are positive developments, such as the Common Word initiative that's happening within Islam. And I know that Tony Blair's Faith Foundation is very involved in trying to encourage engagement, as well as to look at the role of religion in foreign policy, an area that he's believed has been underassessed for many years, when people look at the ideologies and different economic circumstances, but not looking at religious causes. And an outshoot of the Tony Blair initiative, and that was all these initiatives to bring young people together to talk religion. And that's very interesting, but it's quite hard to sell as news stories.
Comment. 9/11 was indeed the thing which has really given a boost to Islam and the coverage of Islam. But the truth of the matter is, Barry Gunter, in his book God Watching, which is a survey of BBC domestic religion coverage, already showed in the early 1990s that questions which questioned different groups, Christian, non-Christian, including Islamic listeners and viewers, asked questions like, do you want more? What happens when your religion comes on? Do you turn over? It was always Islam, which of all the religion sectors, which said, no, we want more, more, more. So the warning signals, if you want, about the demand for more Islam was well before 9/11.
Yeah. No,
Perhaps nobody read Barry Gunter's report.
Quite. And there were some of us reporting on Islam before 9/11. In fact, I mentioned this Revolution and Reform within Islam series that I was doing. A lot of other people were talking about it, but it just wasn't. It was almost like it suddenly caught the news editors at the top unawares with 9/11. It's like, oh, we're playing catch up. And that unfortunately happens quite a lot. It's a reactive environment in the media, more than it should be. And again, that's why I think it's great to have specialists, because there it can be less reactive and more proactive in the sorts of things that you report on.
We have time for one more, two more, three more. All right. June Park first, and then Dennis McGilvery, and then our friend in the front. So we'll start over here to my left.
I myself did research on journalism of religion in the context of Korea. What I found interesting is that most of the times journalism is critical of religion. Sometimes they do cover religion in a positive manner. And I found that they have kind of expectations of religion. I mean, what religion can do for society. Can you tell me one or more experiences where when you cover religion in a positive manner, and why did you decide to do that?
I would say I didn't set out with an agenda to say, right, this is a positive story, but there have been tragic stories out of which some very positive messages have come from communities, Christian communities, in a couple of instances I can think of. So we had the July 7th bombings in London, tragic events, the London Underground bombed, and a London bus in Tavistock Square. And a young man called Anthony Fatai Williams was killed in the London bus bombing. And I approached his mother, Marie Fatai Williams. And of course, as a human being, I felt a little bit reluctant. It's like, here's a woman in full grief for her only son. And yet I'd heard that she had a deep Christian faith. The Catholic cathedral that she attended gave me her number. I asked permission from her to get the number. And she gave the most moving interview I've ever done in my life. And this was within 24 hours of losing her son in this bombing. And the interview went out on the on the morning news programme on BBC Radio 4 called Today, which is usually a very gladiatorial presenter versus politician, 3-minute of hard fighting over political issues of the day. This went out at about 8 minutes and really stunned a mainstream audience and a lot of editors, because she talked in great depth and with huge heart about her son and about the impact of the bombings on her family, but also about her deep Christian faith, how she forgave the bombers. This was 24 hours later, and of how she prayed for the bombers' families. And it was a really, really moving event that came out of something that was a real tragic case, and you could just have focused on, here we go again, and looking at sort of the negatives of religion. But this was something that was very, very positive and very moving came out of it. And in those sorts of situations, when I was Washington correspondent a few years ago, there was the tragic shootings in Amish country in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County. And that was a fascinating example of the media rushed there. All the hosts of the evening news channels were there. There were all these satellite trucks parked. It was two worlds colliding, because you had all these satellite trucks and journalists standing there reporting as a horse-drawn cart went past, and you just thought, wow. And in other ways, I mean, that was a physical illustration of these two worlds colliding, but also when you interviewed some of these families who'd lost their children in this tragic shooting, they talked about forgiveness, and the Bible told them to believe in, a certain approach that was forgiving. They instantly forgave the families, and it was very moving, and it really was where things stood still for the secular media, and it's like, oh, this is religion in a very different light. So, I didn't set out to say, right, I'm going to do a positive religion story, but some events allow those moments to unfold, and they were very moving to report on as well as to listen to, I think.
I'd like to give you an opportunity to return to Stuart Hoover's question about whether some religions are treated differently in the media or more difficult to cover. By way of background, just let me explain. I teach in the anthropology department here at CU, and I do research in Sri Lanka. And so I've been aware that from a media point of view, it's often very ironic and difficult for reporters to report from a place like Sri Lanka, which has produced violence that has religious overtones to it, that doesn't want to conform to our stereotypes of the religions that we may have ahead of time. Just two examples, and then I'd like you just to maybe offer some comments if you can think of any. The recently concluded civil war in Sri Lanka, which concluded in 2009, was conducted by a rebel group called the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam.
And it was very often the case in the press that it was assumed that they were a religious group, that their cause was some kind of religious protest. And it was assumed that because they speak Tamil, they must all be Hindus. And yet, ironically, some of the most powerful members of that group were Christians. And many of the suicide bombers were Christians, something that never really came out very much in any of the articles I read. And then more recently, and since we're in Boulder, I think we have to bring this up, it seems to me that Buddhism always gets a very easy treatment in the press, and it's the favorite religion here in Boulder for sure. And yet, as I think many in the room will know, I mean, recently there's been a very militant religious conflict led by Buddhist monks in places like Burma and also in Sri Lanka, directed ironically against the Muslims. So, and these are sort of counterintuitive stories, it seems to me, and it seems like they really are a challenge to journalism.
They are, yeah, absolutely.
And do you have any reactions or observations or suggestions about how they could be treated better or covered better?
When you mentioned Sri Lanka, I then thought of Myanmar, Burma, and the way that Buddhist monks have been inciting violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority. And that has shocked a lot of people around the world who understood Buddhism to be a vegetarian, often it's not, but a vegetarian, peace-loving, very gentle, meditative religion focused on raising one's consciousness and achieving enlightenment. And of course, the truth as lived on the ground is often quite different. And like everybody, news journalists have to catch up on that sometimes. And that's certainly been the case in Myanmar, Burma. I think that technically the BBC now calls Burma Myanmar. So, but it is a challenge, and you're right. Quite often, Buddhism and Hinduism have been given gentle treatments. Though I remember reporting a lot on Hinduism in India and the nationalist parties and the ultra-nationalist parties there, which give a very different face to Hinduism than the ones that we often see in America, in Boulder, for instance. So, yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, and I think it's right that some religions are possibly treated more gently than others. Of course, it also depends on where you're coming from and which media you're talking about, and there's an ongoing, I mean, this isn't just purely religion, of course, but in America it's seen that Israel is given more positive treatment in the press, and that it's quite the opposite in Europe. And there's an ongoing issue about that, and the BBC often has to find itself answering to arguments and reports over whether its reporting of the Middle East and conflict in the Middle East and the sectarian, religious, other overtones is fair and balanced, and that is an ongoing issue.
All right, you have the last question.
Hi. Thank you for a lovely presentation, Jane. I just want to ask you on the practitioner's perspective, because I work as an assistant producer at the Islam Channel in London, and attached with them, and I think it's find a bit hard to balance, between the moderate views and the extremists, because I've been asked to do some filtering when inviting some people on the show. So what is your experience, maybe a suggestion, so any comments about that balancing act?
It's a very difficult one. It's one faced by programs every day, but especially when something happens in Islam, for instance, some extremists or something happens, and then there is a lot of internal navel gazing among editorial staff as to whether it's justified to call in the extremist who might have 3 followers to talk about a story. And there is no clear line as to when you do that, but I think sometimes it is justified to call in the Chowdhuries of this world if something's happened within that sphere that he can talk about, as long as you contextualize, as long as you basically say this isn't a guy with 500,000 followers who's got 5 followers in Finsbury Park, and it's that sort of thing that you have to be. It's the context is all, I think, and as we discussed, it's kind of difficult to apply these categories, moderate and conservative or ultra-conservative or ultra-orthodox, and then it gets really confusing when you talk about ultra-orthodox. in different settings. So I think it's an ongoing challenge, but clearly, I mean, certainly I can talk from the BBC perspective and WGBH Boston, there is always a real effort to try to balance, to be as impartial as possible, while at the same time recognising that we all come with our own frames of reference and that it is an ongoing challenge to try to do that.
On behalf of the attendees of the conference, Media and Religion, the Global View, and the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture, and the University of Colorado, I want to thank you, Jane, and invite our audience to thank you.
Thank you very much.
As it says in the program of the conference, you're invited now to join Jane and staff and your fellow conferees at a reception in Jane's honor. It takes place in a different building than the one we're in. The building is called the Koenig Alumni Center, and a number of us in the room are going to be sort of heading in that direction and heading out, and we can go as a group and you can find it. It's not far away, but if you do happen to get separated, I can just say the easiest way to find it is if you go out that entrance of this building and turn left and follow the sidewalk. It's the building, the only building on the right before you come to the end of campus, and it will be brightly lit and it looks like a house, and that's where you'll find us enjoying refreshments. So we'll see you there in a few minutes. It's just, you know, I would love every time we have
Oh, sure.
you want us shaking hands? Or? Okay.